It was a day no one in the legal world could ignore. The headlines screamed of an unprecedented decision. Congresswoman and former civil rights attorney Jasmine Crockett had been hit with a staggering $500 million fine by none other than Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. The case, rooted in Crockett's relentless investigations into judicial ethics and financial corruption, had already caused tremors through the highest levels of power. But the fine, announced during a closed-door emergency session, was what transformed the tremor into a political earthquake. According to the initial court order, Crockett was accused of sustained defamation and abuse of public office to target judicial integrity, a charge her supporters immediately called absurd and unconstitutional. The fine, clearly excessive, sparked outrage from legal scholars and civil rights advocates across the nation. But Crockett, known for her steel nerves and legal mind, didn't flinch. Instead, she walked into the next court hearing with a calm expression and a thick binder of evidence. What happened next would turn the courtroom on its head and leave Judge Thomas regretting the day he tried to silence her. As the courtroom filled to capacity, murmurs rippled through the spectators and media seated in the back rows. Crockett's legal team was small, but composed of respected attorneys known for their tenacity. Thomas sat high above the courtroom, his expression cold and unreadable. Flanked by a panel of appellate judges who had been summoned to oversee the rare hearing, Crockett began by requesting permission to speak directly, something rarely granted to a non-judge in such proceedings. Surprisingly, Thomas approved it. Perhaps he believed she'd embarrass herself. Instead, she approached the podium with a quiet confidence and delivered an opening statement that captivated everyone in the room. "This isn't just about a fine," she began. "It's about whether we still have a constitution that protects us from authoritarian power cloaked in robes." The courtroom fell silent. She then produced records hundreds of pages that detailed a shocking pattern of undisclosed gifts, travel perks, and private funding received by Thomas over the past 2 decades. Every line item was backed with documentation. The very courtroom that was meant to shame her was now witnessing the exposure of something much bigger. She laid out emails, handwritten notes, and even photographic evidence of Thomas attending luxury events sponsored by billionaires who had cases before the court. "This is not conjecture," Crockett said, her voice growing stronger. "This is a betrayal of public trust, and I won't be bullied into silence for daring to speak it." One document in particular struck a nerve, an internal memo from a corporate executive thanking Thomas for his loyalty in times of political turbulence. Audible gasps filled the chamber. The appellate judges began exchanging glances, some scribbled furiously in their notebooks. It was clear the courtroom was no longer focused on Crockett's alleged wrongdoing, but on the mountain of questions surrounding Thomas himself. Her voice didn't shake once. She continued, "The fine levied against me is not about justice. It's about fear. Fear of accountability. Fear of being seen. But you can't find away the truth." At that moment, the courtroom shifted. Even those who had entered skeptical of Crockett's motives now leaned forward, captivated by the gravity of what she had uncovered. It was no longer a trial, it was a reckoning. Crockett then turned to the financial analysis portion of her presentation. Her team had collaborated with investigative journalists and forensic accountants to track the money trails. She outlined how multiple luxury trips Thomas had taken were paid for by shell corporations, how those entities were linked to political action groups, and how those same groups had cases that landed in front of the Supreme Court. The numbers were clear, the paths undeniable. "Say I defame the court," Crockett said sharply. But the court defamed itself when it failed to uphold the standards it enforces on everyone else. A hushed murmur spread again. Even the court stenographer looked stunned. Thomas sat motionless, but the slight clench of his jaw didn't go unnoticed by anyone watching. One appellate judge leaned forward and asked for clarification on a certain transaction. Crockett responded fluently, citing page and source without hesitation. Wasn't just defending herself, she was on the offensive. Originally gathered to support Thomas's disciplinary measure, was slowly beginning to question whether they had been summoned to a legitimate hearing or a personal vendetta. The courtroom energy had completely reversed. It wasn't just about numbers and documents. Crockett also brought forward testimony letters from clerks and retired judges and legal scholars, all expressing concern over Thomas's conduct in recent years. One former federal clerk, whose identity was protected for safety reasons, submitted a statement recounting being instructed to suppress certain case assignments that might cause political complications for Thomas's allies. "This goes beyond politics," Crockett declared. "This is about the integrity of an institution that should be untouchable, unaccountable." Her words pierced the air like thunder. One appellate judge visibly nodded, clearly moved. Thomas, for his part, looked rattled, gripping the armrests of his chair as if bracing against a storm. Meanwhile, media outside the courthouse were broadcasting the hearing live, and people across the country were glued to their screens. The tide was turning. The fine that was meant to ruin Crockett had become a platform to elevate her voice and expose corruption on a scale that shocked even longtime insiders. Her strategy was brilliant, not just legal, but moral. She made the courtroom and the world reconsider who really stood for justice. The turning point came when Crockett addressed the panel directly. "Ask yourselves," she said, "what message does it send to punish those who expose wrongdoing while rewarding those who conceal it? If the scales of justice tip only for the powerful, then they are no longer scales, they are shackles." There was silence, followed by a whisper from one of the panel members to their clerk. Crockett's legal opponent attempted to object, citing procedural overreach, but was promptly overruled by the chief appellate judge, who declared that the material presented was of exceptional public interest and relevance. Crockett took a step back, breathing slowly. Her job, at least in the moment, was done. Courtroom sat frozen, absorbing the weight of what had just been said and shown. The so-called punishment against her had boomeranged into a full-fledged investigation into judicial ethics at the highest level. By the end of the day, the appellate panel announced that the enforcement of the $500 million fine would be suspended pending further review, and an independent ethics committee would be formed to review the conduct of Justice Thomas. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had triggered a national reckoning. The days following the hearing saw an avalanche of media coverage. News outlets across the spectrum debated the implications, but the public response was crystal clear. A surge of support flooded Crockett's office. Crowdfunding platforms launched by supporters raised millions for judicial reform. Protesters gathered outside courthouses nationwide, holding signs that read accountability for all and Crockett was right. Legal organizations drafted petitions to push for term limits and mandatory disclosure laws for Supreme Court justices. Meanwhile, Clarence Thomas remained largely silent. No interviews, no press statements. His legal team scrambled behind the scenes, reportedly preparing for what insiders called an inevitable storm of subpoenas. Several lawmakers, both progressive and moderate, cited Crockett's findings as the catalyst for introducing sweeping judiciary reform legislation. And through it all, Crockett maintained her composure. She told reporters, "My goal was never vengeance, it was justice." Her words, simple yet powerful, echoed in every article, every editorial, every debate. It was clear the narrative had shifted. She had not only dismantled the accusation against her, but turned the very institution against the man who tried to break her in Congress. The ripple effects grew into waves. House and Senate Judiciary Committees called for formal reviews into all justices' financial disclosures. Chief Justice John Roberts faced mounting pressure to publicly address the crisis. Within weeks, an independent panel was formed to audit past judicial gifts and trips. A proposed Judicial Integrity Act, inspired by Crockett's battle, gained bipartisan support. The bill aimed to limit undisclosed financial relationships, require annual ethics reports, and empower an external watchdog agency to oversee the judiciary. Crockett was invited to testify before the committee drafting the legislation. Her testimony was as compelling as her courtroom performance. "This is not about revenge," she said, "but about restoring trust. A democracy without accountability is merely a shadow of freedom." Meanwhile, Thomas's reputation, once untouchable, began to crumble under the weight of years of uncovered improprieties. What began as an attempt to bury one woman in legal penalties had ignited a legal revolution. And Crockett stood at the center of it, not as a victim, but as a leader. By the end of the month, the $500 million fine was officially dismissed. panel ruled it unconstitutional, politically motivated, and void of legal standing. In their written opinion, they stated, "The attempt to suppress critical speech and punish investigative inquiry contradicts the fundamental principles of judicial fairness." It was